Hi, everyone. I'm Tara Walpert-Levy, Vice President of the Americas at YouTube, and I am honored today to introduce this program marking International Holocaust Remembrance Day 2024. This day was chosen by the United Nations to mark the anniversary of the liberation of Auschwitz in 1945 and remembers the genocide of 6 million Jews, one-third of the world's Jewish population at the time, and millions of others from a wide range of marginalized groups who all perished at the hands of the Nazis. Programs on this day understandably typically focus on the survivors and the aftermath of the Holocaust. But the increase in anti-Semitism and Holocaust denial that is sweeping the globe have prompted us to take a slightly different tack today. And we will instead revisit with a renowned educator the circumstances leading up to the Holocaust. You will hear from descendants of victims and survivors, literally living memorials to those who died, what it means to be living in a time of rising anti-Semitic hate, which sometimes feels all too familiar and frankly a little close for comfort for those who were raised on stories by their parents and grandparents of what life was like before the camps. To those who would lift their voices to fight such hate as allies, we will offer words of encouragement. And we'll conclude with a charge from the CEO of AJC about the importance of remembering the lessons of the Holocaust and combating anti-Semitism wherever it may be. Our hope is that this program will help prevent future massacres, acts of anti-Semitism, and dehumanization, that it will help us to remember those who have perished and inspire us to never forget our shared humanity. With that in mind, I turn things over to Todd Hennessy. Todd is a Holocaust education consultant, facilitator, and researcher, and is associated with several internationally recognized Holocaust education institutions. Todd, over to you.
Thank you, Tara, and thank you for inviting me to be here today as we recognize International Holocaust Remembrance Day on the 79th anniversary of the liberation of the Auschwitz-Birkenau complex. The Holocaust is a very difficult history. The Holocaust is a very large history. The Holocaust does not happen in a vacuum. There are many steps, there are many processes that take place, that need to take place to get us from the beginning, obviously, to the end. When we look at the Holocaust, it's not just a chronological piece from when Adolf Hitler becomes chancellor in 1933 to VE Day in May of 1945, but we must look at pre-Holocaust Jewish life prior to any of that taking place. And obviously, we must look at what's happening today as we still have survivors of the Holocaust with us here. This event is large. The vastness of it, as we look at the number of victims, as we look at the number of countries that are involved, as we look at the perpetrators and their collaborators, we often, too many times, get caught up in numbers, in sheer size, and it is truly enormous. What we should truly recognize looking at is trying to break it down into each individual victim as much as we can and get their entire narrative. Even if they perished in the Holocaust, there are ways that we can then dig deeper into who these individuals are and what their life looked like prior to their experience in the Holocaust. And if they survived, then what their life looks like now and how that has contributed to our current society and contributed to the community that we are involved in. This particular slide focuses on 3 individuals. These are 3 Holocaust victims. We're going to come back to this slide here in a few moments. But I'd like you to recognize that, again, as we look at this large number, this 6 million, we know this number. It is so important to bring it down as much as we can, as often as we can, to each individual person and their narrative, their experience in the Holocaust. Many years ago, There was a U.S. publication in cooperation with a number of other agencies in the Holocaust education community that put out a survey across the country asking very specific questions about the Holocaust, knowledge of the Holocaust. And some of those questions refer to who is responsible for the Holocaust. And as you can imagine, many, but not all, recognized Hitler as being responsible. And of course, there are many, many others that are responsible as perpetrators, collaborators, etc. One of the questions was, what is Auschwitz? How do you describe a facility like this? Again, the sheer size, the scope, the enormity of this camp, and then taking it down into the individual pieces, and furthermore, to those individual people who were sent there. Those that did not survive, those that did survive and were moved to other camps or were liberated from Auschwitz. And obviously, of course, we look at that large number, 6 million of the Jewish victims of the Holocaust. The picture, excuse me, on the top right, that is from Yad Vashem, outside of the main memorial museum at Yad Vashem, recognizing the 6 million victims. So again, when we look at that large number, we try to bring that back to those individuals. And I mentioned these three earlier. And the reason why we're doing three specifically is when you look at pre-Holocaust Jewish population in Europe, and then you look at the population after the Holocaust, 2 out of every 3 Jews of Europe were murdered during the Holocaust. This slide not only represents these 3 individual experiences, but we also have a survivor and who is still with us today, and that is Nessie on the left-hand side. So when you look at this, this is also a representation not only of their experience, but also of the Jewish population in whole. This does not also look at some of the other narratives. We don't have Kindertransport. We don't have hidden children. We don't have those individuals who had false papers. But the importance of these 3 Holocaust victims is that they come from 3 different countries, Lithuania, France, and Ukraine. They have 3 somewhat similar, but also very, very different experiences, roughly at the same time, but also spread out. And that's the important piece of this, is not every victim is going to go to a concentration camp. Not every victim is going to experience a train ride. Not every victim is going to go to a ghetto or be in a killing field in the former Soviet territories. So Nessie's experience, starting off in Lithuania, is her family is going to be sent to a ghetto, then she's going to be sent to a concentration camp, not a killing center, even though Stutthof does have killing facilities, and then she's going to be placed on a death march. Nadine is going to be the child of a foreign-born Jew in France. She and her mother are going to be sent to the Drancy transit camp just north of Paris. They are going to be separated. She's going to be sent by herself to the Auschwitz killing center, where she will be murdered upon arrival. And Edek is going to be sent to a ghetto within his own town. He's never put on a train, he's not put on a march or a walk, and he's going to be there with his grandparents. He and his grandparents, along with the Jews of his village, Saint-Denis, are going to be murdered in an Einsatzgruppe action. So again, 3 different countries, 3 children of the Holocaust, 3 victims, 2 that do not survive, 1 that does. And this is just a obviously very small sample size of all of the other narratives that are there, whether it's from the Netherlands or from Hungary or from Italy or from Norway. And this is that size that we need to look at. This is that scope that we need to look at. And again, bring it down to each individual experience, each individual narrative, and when we have the opportunity, because of their survival, each individual testimony that goes along with this, so that we can learn as much as we can, not only about their experience during the Holocaust, but also about their pre-Holocaust Jewish life, what their family structure looked like, what they experienced, what their hopes, goals, dreams were, and then if they survived, how they have moved forward and how they have participated in society since then. When we look at this event, especially in the school system, unfortunately, all too often, the Holocaust is placed inside of a World War II unit in a middle school or a high school classroom setting. Obviously, the Holocaust, when you look at this particular slide, far expands the history of the Second World War. Holocaust is recognized as beginning in 1933 with the appointment of Hitler as chancellor, and it ends on May 8th, VE Day, in Europe. We also know that this event starts long before Hitler becomes chancellor. We know this event is going to expand again into today. And then you have the other events, the final solution, which is recognized as the systematic murder of Europe's Jews. Now, we know that there were murders. We know that there were killings that take place prior to June 1941. Kristallnacht, for example. We know that Dachau was opened in 1933. And even though Jews are not sent there specifically because they're Jewish in most cases, we are going to have Jews that will be murdered in Dachau prior to 1938, prior to 1941. And then you have the United States involvement beginning in December of 1941. And this obviously is the last stage of looking at this particular slide and what happens in the chronological piece with the Holocaust. Geographically, when we look at Europe in 1933, these borders had changed after the conclusion of World War I. These borders are going to change a little bit even before the beginning of World War II in September 1939. And obviously, these borders are much different today. Geography becomes a huge part of this history on many different levels. When was a country invaded by Nazi Germany? Is it a collaborative country? Is it a country that's going to see concentration camps? Is this a country that's going to see killing centers, et cetera? So geography plays a huge role in this, and where the populations of Europe's Jews are located and how the steps of the final solution are going to be carried out. When we look at the definition of the Holocaust, the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum and others who will define this, defines it as the systematic, bureaucratic, state-sponsored persecution and murder of approximately 6 million Jews by the Nazi government and its collaborators. We know that there are other victim groups that are persecuted, that are murdered during the era of the Holocaust. In some cases, those victims are murdered right alongside Jewish victims, sometimes at the same locations, the same camps. But please keep in mind, when we talk about the Holocaust, we are talking simply about the Jewish victim of the Nazi policy of systematic murder, what we're going to see with the final solution, and everything that takes place prior to that. So the Holocaust is specific to the Jewish population. Other victim groups, yes, are recognized as victims of the era of the Holocaust. And like I said, in some cases, even in the same locations and sometimes right alongside the Jewish victims as well. We look at the symbology of the Holocaust on many different levels, and this is one of those symbols that is very, very recognizable within the Holocaust, and in a lot of cases, very, very emotional as well, and rightfully so. But this also illustrates, again, the geography. It represents the chronological piece to this. For example, when was the star implemented in a certain country? For how long was that? And what it also does is it gives us another piece of the depth of the Holocaust as far as each individual victim's experience within that. So you'll see examples of a button in Bulgaria. You'll see the Star of David from Germany, from the Netherlands, from Belgium, from France. You're going to see two different Stars of David from Poland, or the general government. Poland ceases to exist shortly after the invasion of Poland in 1939. And at various locations within the general government of what was formerly known as Poland, and at various times, you could have Polish Jews wearing just a yellow star, or they might just be wearing the white armband, or they might be wearing both, and we have found is that in some locations, they could be wearing something even different from this. We know that in the Soviet territory of Latvia, the Soviet territory of Ukraine, that there were squares that were used. And that square could be on the front of the clothing, or it could be on the back of the clothing, or on the arm. And so we're going to see varying pieces. So again, this history is not black and white. It isn't always the same from location to location or from time to time. Not every victim is going to get on a train. Not every victim is going to be in a ghetto. Not every victim is going to go to a killing center / concentration camp. So images like this help us illustrate, again, the vastness, the size, the geography, the chronology of this event and how we study it. The somewhat irony to this is that even though we look at the Holocaust beginning in Germany with Nazi policy, Germany is not the first country to require their Jews to wear the Star of David. In fact, the first Jews to be required to wear an identifying mark are going to be the Jews of Poland, the general government. Germany is going to be one of the latter countries, September of 1941, where Jews are going to be required to wear the Star of David. Anti-Semitism obviously is a major component. There's no denying that anti-Semitism is a piece of the Holocaust. And it's rather frustrating when you hear that anti-Semitism doesn't have a place with this. Not true. The history of anti-Semitism does not start with the Nazis. Anti-Semitism had been around for centuries, many, many centuries, in many other locations prior to the Nazis taking power, being appointed power in 1933. These are just three examples. There are many others that go along with this of anti-Semitism in other countries outside of Germany. You have the Edict of Expulsion, which is in Spain in 1492. You have the Protocols of the Elders of Zion. That's going to come from Tsarist Russia in the late 19th century. You're going to have individuals like Karl Lueger, who's the mayor of Vienna in the early 20th centuries. You're going to have other incidents like the Dreyfus Affair in France. And all of these are going to play a part in what we're going to see in Germany. Again, anti-Semitism is not a Nazi invention, and still, obviously, it's unbelievably prevalent around the globe. When we look at pre-Holocaust Europe, when we look at the origins of the Holocaust, and we look at the beginning of the Holocaust, one of those events that is frequently recognized is the end of the First World War, specifically the Treaty of Versailles. And a number of the steps that are in the Treaty of Versailles are going to be very, very impactful, specifically on Germany, when the Nazis, again, are in control after January of 1933. And they're going to then want to fix, or they're going to want to amend what took place in the Treaty of Versailles, whether that's area. Germany had lost area due to the Treaty of Versailles, or the size of their military, or colonization, things of that nature. So the Treaty of Versailles really is looked at by many historians as kind of that beginning of Nazi thought that we're going to see that's going to evolve into Nazi policy, which is then going to bring us into the early stages of the Holocaust, moving towards the final solution. So this list is not exhaustive. This list, there's many other pieces that are going to be in the steps from 1918 up until January of 1933 that are going to give us an indication and give us levels of how the Holocaust is going to get to what we know of it today. And so again, it does not happen in a vacuum. It's not just the Nazis taking control. It's not just one person who's leading that party moving forward. The elections in Germany are a fascinating and frustrating piece to this history. And you look at the number of different political parties in Germany. There's over 20 different political parties in Germany vying for positions within the government, within the Reichstag, within controlling the country. And we're going to look obviously at the right, and we're going to look at the left. And there's those that are going to also be in the center. We focus a lot, obviously, on the right. We focus on the Nazis and how the Nazis are gaining momentum, how they're gaining seats. And by 1932, they are the most popular party. But we cannot exclude what's taking place to the left, and that's the German Communist Party that is also gaining momentum. And knowing the German political system and knowing that none of these parties are going to maintain more than 50% of the vote, a coalition government is going to need to be formed in order to stop the greatest threat in Germany in the early 1930s. And the greatest threat in Germany in early 1930s is not the Nazi Party, but it's the Communist Party of Germany, the KPD. And the coalition government that's going to be formed between Hindenburg and Hitler is going to be put together in order to combat the Communist Party, Germany not wanting to go the way of communism, as had been done in the East. And so Hindenburg's going to stay in the president's position. Hitler is going to be appointed into the chancellor's position. And this is going to then start the process of the Nazis then gaining more and more control. We're going to have the death of Hindenburg, which is not suspicious. He's not murdered. And we're going to then have Adolf Hitler becoming the Fuhrer, the leader of Germany, abolishing the presidential position. So again, once Hitler is appointed chancellor in January of 1933, looking just towards what we know as Kristallnacht, or what's more commonly being referred to today as the Nazi pogrom, is all of the steps that have to take place in between. And again, this list is not all inclusive. There's many, many other steps that take place here. But looking at the Reichstag fire, which is again going to give us the Reichstag fire decree, the Enabling Act. Dachau is going to open as the first concentration camp for political opponents. We're going to have boycotts. We're going to have Jews being eliminated from civil service. You're going to have the court systems being run by the Nazis themselves. The unbelievable identification of the Jewish population of Germany through the Nuremberg laws in September of 1935, and then getting us to the Nazi pogrom. Obviously, the Evian Conference is not listed in here. The Olympics are not listed in here in 1936. Again, this list is much larger, and so many of these steps have to take place in order for us to get to, again, where we're recognizing the Holocaust as it is today. At this point in time, by 1938, we're still all confined for the most part within Germany, and we do not have a single killing center at this point in time. And Jews are not being targeted for murder as Jews at the moment. This is going to change once the Second World War starts, specifically with Operation Barbarossa in June of 1941. One of the questions that gets asked in this history all too often is, as the Nazis gained momentum, as the Nazis gained power, and as the life of German Jews becomes harder and harder in the 1930s, why didn't they just leave? And when we look at the German Jewish population in 1933, when Hitler is appointed, it's approximately a half a million of Germany's population are Jews. And that number is less than 0.5% of the entire German population at this point in time. When we get to November of 1938, we have the Reich pogrom, Kristallnacht, and those numbers are estimated at approximately 356,000. So we have a little less than 2 million a little less than 200,000 have already left at this point in time. By the time we get to September 1939, more than half of Germany's Jews have left Germany. Where this becomes problematic is the majority of them are going to be in countries that are surrounding Germany, mostly to the west, that are going to be then invaded by Germany after the Second World War starts. It's not just as simple as leaving Germany. The process, the paperwork, the cost for Germany's Jews to leave Germany is astronomical. That's just to leave, the decision to leave. Then you have to get into the bureaucracy of where can they go. Obviously, the United States is not very helpful at this point in time. Our immigration quotas are ridiculous. Transportation, cost, everything else is really prohibitive. The United States at this point is not very helpful in a very blanket sense of bringing Europe's Jews to the United States. And there's a number of different reasons behind this. But when we look at this question, why didn't they just leave? It's not just as simple as saying they wanted to. And so we have to keep that in mind. And again, those that do get out, the vast majority of them, and a great example of this, like, is Anne Frank's family. Otto Frank gets his family out very early under Nazi Germany occupation. And they get to the Netherlands, and then they're just going to be there when the Nazis invaded in 1940. And then we know Anne Frank's story from there. So again, it's just not that simple to leave. When we look at the history of the Holocaust in a number of education circles, not all of them, we try to explain the evolution of the Holocaust. And one of those explanations is done by what is referred to as the 4 E's. And that's how the Holocaust is going to start in Nazi Germany, with the exclusion of Germany's Jews from everyday German society. And that's going to be removing them from certain positions, removing them from schools, the removal of sitting in park benches or being in certain locations in Germany. And then you're going to have the Nuremberg laws. And so that exclusion piece is going to be that first piece. We can look at this 80 plus years later and we can say, well, there was not a lot of pushback on this. So the thought is then it's going to move into the expulsion piece. So again, they're being expelled from professions, they're being expelled from education. Now we're going to have them being expelled from their homes. We're going to have them expelled from businesses that they own. And we're going to have forced deportation of non-German Jews first out of the country back to their country of origin. Again, we're not going to have a lot of pushback by this from the international community, and that's going to move into the exploitation. So now that property that was taken, the wealth that was taken through exit visas and things of that nature, through banking takes and that nature, and forced labor. Once German Jews are moved into slave labor locations, for example, the Lodz ghetto, that exploitation piece is going to take place. And then that finally is going to move into extermination. And as I mentioned, there were murders, there were deaths prior to the invasion of the Soviet Union in June of 1941. But that true final solution, that extermination phase, when you have the Einsatzgruppe, the mobile killing squads, when you have the 6 killing centers that are open, the large number of concentration camps at this point in time now across Europe, and you have the majority of the major ghettos that are still open, we get into that extermination phase. So again, this is not just going to be a simple process of starting with killing centers, gas chambers, moving into extermination in 1933. There is an evolution to this. As I conclude today, we use the hashtag #WeRemember. We use this year round, but this has great prominence at this time of year. And again, in April/May for Yom HaShoah, we remember. And the idea behind this, the thought behind this is that, and you can say never forget as well too, is we must remember the history. We must remember how this happened, why this happened, when this happened, and most importantly of all, who this happened to. And I challenge people all the time to know someone by name, know a victim by name, whether they perished in the Holocaust or they survived, to know their narrative, to know their history, because it's all too easy. It's appropriate. It's all too easy to say how large this event is and throw out astronomical numbers. But what's more important is to talk about the people and talk about who they are, who they were, and not forget what we're missing. We, in this history, talk about the absence of presence or the presence of absence. And it's staggering to think about what was lost on so many different levels. Yes, the loss of life is astronomical, but we also have the loss of community. We have the loss of culture. And we have, probably most importantly, I think, besides the loss of that individual person, is that loss of possibility of what could have been. And so as we look at International Holocaust Remembrance Day, as we remember the victims of the Holocaust, I challenge you, please, to remember those victims, remember them by name, remember them by their narrative, and hopefully we will never forget.
So anti-Semitism, what does it feel like today compared to the days of our grandparents? I think one of the things that is strange and kind of almost disappointing is I never in my lifetime thought that I would ever experience anything from the stories my grandparents told me about. And yet I go to synagogue and armed security guards outside in New Jersey, and you see swastikas, being drawn on buildings and
Bomb threats,
bomb
synagogues.
threats, hate messages, things like that. I remember my grandmother, my mother's mother, she so loved the United States. When it was just like such a place of like safety to her. And she lived to be 96. And I remember her talking about the US in such glowing terms. And I have to be honest with you, I'm really thrilled she's not alive right now, because I think looking at the landscape would kill her.
Yeah.
In preparation for this discussion, I spent a little time reviewing my grandmother's testimony, listening to her talk. And at the end, she had our whole family there with her, present day. At that time, it was, 1996, I think, when that was recorded. And, she said it's history for my grandchildren. They don't know what it was like, and they have no concept of it. And they couldn't believe that something like this could actually be. And then, in the beginning of her story, I listened to her talk about what was happening with the shops in Germany. She was in Berlin, and, sitting here in San Francisco, reading news stories about Jewish shops with smashed windows and swastikas and, ethnic slurs being spray painted on their buildings. I can't imagine how she would react to something like that after all this time. And also, like Naomi, like your grandmother, loving this country and the opportunity it afforded her and her family, and finally the safety, and to now have all of these things coming back into play, as well as with students in universities, because she was a student when this happened in Germany. She was, 13, 14, 15, and she left Germany when she was 16 to go to Israel on a youth aliyah, and never to see her family again. But the lead up of what happened in schools and how all of this anti-Semitism in the schools with the students and the children, it's really saddening to hear, and now to see what's happening across universities as well. It's I'm glad she's not here to see that and read about it.
And David, I similarly watched the testimony of my grandmother. My paternal grandmother was talking about her idyllic childhood in Europe. And she grew up in a small town in Ada, which was Yugoslavia at the time. And they had, she said that the Jewish community was in good shape. They had support from the locals. She had some of her best friends in public school were non-Jews, and they got along really well. And then within a week, the Nazis came to invade their town. And what struck me in listening to that is how things can so quickly change and become terrible, and how she and her siblings were totally taken, but like their parents were murdered just for being Jewish. Her older sister was murdered with her 4 children, who she refused to leave. Her younger brother was a baby. And the only thing that saved her is that she and her sisters volunteered to do slave labor in a labor camp. So within a week, their lives completely changed. It scares me and terrifies me to think that today we have such overt anti-Semitism, and how things can turn in such a short period of time. To think that the Hungarians, who they were really close to, they were native Hungarians, were actually very quick to help the Nazis in rounding them up and shooting them and doing all the horrific things that they did during the Holocaust. So that's what really terrifies me in thinking about my grandmother's story.
They had a town meeting in my town a couple of weeks ago, and what really, really shocked the Jewish community here was just how bold some of our neighbors were in espousing anti-Semitic rhetoric. And these are people we've lived alongside. It just evoked, memories of stories that you thought were never going to come true. To the point that you made, they were history. Imagine being afraid to light a menorah in your window because you're afraid someone's going to throw a rock through it. And not because of anything that you've done, just because someone just hates you enough to do it. And sometimes it feels like people feel like that about you today.
Yeah, we've certainly seen reports of the signs being carried that basically are saying just that.
The ability to dehumanize someone so fast is astonishing. The silence of people while it's going on is astonishing.
Yeah, and it's not just the silence of, your neighbors or, others, but also, the silence of some of us. I was listening to my grandmother's story, and she was talking about how all of this was going on, but her father was a World War II German veteran soldier with an Iron Cross decorated, and he was, very much proud to be German. And there was a belief that this will pass, and this whole regime, or they said, after the situation changes, because they were at that point too scared to say after Hitler goes away. And so they would say after the situation changes, things will be better. And a lot of people stayed and didn't leave and didn't take action because not necessarily because they were afraid, but because they were quiet. They didn't want to confront the situation, and they didn't think it would continue. Certainly not as it did. And that's why it's important to speak up and important for us to tell these stories to each
Yeah, I
other.
mean,
or
that's
families.
exactly what happened with most of my family. I mean, except for my grandmother and her younger brother, pretty much all of them said, it'll get better, it'll stop. And of course, huge family, almost all of them were killed.
One of the directors actually at Google told me that her young child actually had asked her after watching some of, I guess it was on the news or something, yet another act of anti-Semitism. She hadn't necessarily, I think, processed it until he asked her, is there going to be another Holocaust? If you don't stop it at the start, it just becomes normalized and it becomes easier for that second act. And then the next thing you know, you've got violence all over the place.
Next thing you know, you've got a number tattooed on your arm because you're no longer treated like a human being.
I remember when I was actually a little kid, I think I was like 5 or 6. We were at the Shabbos table and my grandmother reached for something and her sleeve pulled up. And I saw the tattoo for the first time. I'm Orthodox. Even then I knew tattoos were not something you did. And I said something, I don't remember exactly what it was. And then there was like utter silence at the table because what are you going to tell a 5-year-old? I don't remember what they actually said to me, to be perfectly honest with you. But I do remember the look on my grandmother's face. And she covered that tattoo up in 5 seconds.
Grandmother's response was, it's from the lagers, which is the German word for concentration camps. And then she wouldn't say another word about it because she was so traumatized that she refused to talk about it.
Mine only, some talked more than others. I remember my father's mother, she did time in Bergen-Belsen, I think, before they sent her to Auschwitz, but it was weird. She'd almost never talk about it, almost never, except once, which was really weird because it made such an impression on me because she almost never talked about it. And I remember she talked about how they would line them up for work detail at Bergen-Belsen. And they would literally make all the prisoners hold their arms up in front of them every single morning, just like this, and hold their arms up and leave them like that until the first prisoner just couldn't anymore. And the first prisoner to put their arms down was shot to death. and then everyone else got to go off to the labor thing. And I remember her telling me that story. She never said anything else about the camps. That story, for some reason, she did. And I remember thinking to myself, I don't know why it's that one. And I remember I was like, how do you do that to another human being?
Not like that, right? It starts out with name calling. It starts out with small persecution, little things that don't seem as horrific. Then it moves to, you can't go to this school because you're Jewish, or you can't own a business because you're Jewish. Then it moves to your windows being smashed and police pulling the Jewish shop owners in Berlin by their beards, and then the SS taking them into protective custody because they're trying to protect the Jews from all of the aggravated citizens.
I'm sure everyone on this call knows, but for people who are watching, Ashkenazic Jews have a custom of naming children after a dead relative in honor of them. So we, pretty much never name, you don't name your child after a parent or anything like that. So growing up, I didn't know who David was. My mom's parents were Morris and Helen. My dad's parents were Ben and Frida. And I didn't know any, I had some uncles, David, but I was like, and I kept asking my mom, who am I named after? It's like, oh, you're named after King David. It wouldn't, I didn't know. So finally, this was probably a few months before my bar mitzvah, my mom takes me and says, I have to tell you something. And I said, I'm adopted, right? And she said, no, you're not adopted. But she said, you are actually, see, and I'm breaking up now just thinking about it. You're named after my father, David, who was taken away by the Nazis when I was 2 years old. And I had never known any of this because my Zaidi, the man who I thought was my grandfather, was actually her stepfather, because my grandmother got remarried after the war to a childhood friend, as it turned out. And they got married in Germany, and he adopted my mom and treated her like a daughter. And it turns out they didn't want me to know when I was little because I wouldn't love my Zaidi anymore because he wasn't my real grandfather, which of course was ridiculous. He was, the sweetest man. I loved him. He was a wonderful person. And actually, I have a picture of my grandfather and grandmother, and this is them. I believe this is them on their honeymoon. So they're probably in their very early 20s here. Maybe my grandmother's even younger. And, and now that I lost all my hair, you can't see, but, I definitely look like him. He's the person in my family I look like the most. So, that always meant a lot to me once I found that, not only am I named after him, but I look like him too. And no one ever heard from him again. We don't know what happened. I mean, I assume he was killed. No one ever heard from him again. His brother helped, and I can talk about this later if we get into it. His brother helped my mom and grandmother when they went into hiding, but then they stopped. He must have been killed also because no one heard from him again, and that was the end of that.
We're commemorating International Holocaust Remembrance Day. How many of their colleagues actually are living memorials to the people who are killed? I'm named for my father's grandparents. He never knew his grandmothers, never got a hug, never any of those things. Their names were actually Peril and Zisel, and my parents totally did not want to do Yiddish names, so they gave the Hebrew equivalent. So I'm Naomi Fanina. They were both murdered in Auschwitz, but there's literally an entire generation of us who are named for people. When you talk about the Holocaust and genocide, my mom told me it was very hard for her at one point to figure out actually how to care properly for my grandmother when she got really old, because she'd never actually seen her mother care for an elderly relative because there were none. There was an entire generation that was just wiped out. Knowing that we're actually named and carrying on those legacies for the people who just never actually had a chance to have a life.
I was also named after my maternal grandfather's sister. And like you, her name was Hinda, which is the Yiddish, which my parents translated to Ayala, which means a deer. But my sister was named after my grandfather's daughter from his first marriage, and she was murdered as a toddler. And so when they decided to name her after a girl who was murdered as a 2-year-old, they wanted to add another name. And typically when we want to give somebody a long life, we might add a name that means life, right? So that she was named Hannah, but they wanted to add something that would also mean that she is, you know, representing the life that this 2-year-old did not have a chance to live. So my sister is Hanagila, which Gila means happiness and life. And she is a living memorial to the life that was cut short.
Yeah, there's a saying from generation to generation, right? And that's how our stories are told. They're handed down from one generation to the next. And I consider myself really fortunate. I had an opportunity after college to live with my grandmother for about 3 years in the same house, and so we got very, very close. For me, we named my son Max. My grandmother's brother, who was 2.5 years younger, she was very close with him when she was living in Germany. He never made it out, so she left when she was 16 years old. She used to tell the story about how she met my grandfather. He also escaped Berlin illegally and then found his way into the British Army and was guarding the camp that she was working in. And so when she was 18, 19 years old, she found herself by herself, pregnant, and there was no one to help her through that. You know, she said, I missed my mother dearly because, you know, I really could have used that at that time. And you know, her brother was also sending letters at that time saying, I'm going to come to see you when the situation changes. And you know, she never heard from them again. She heard that they, you know, ended up getting rounded up and they were going to go to Riga, but the transport never arrived. She used to say she just hopes it was eliminated, and we don't know what happened. You know, we named my son Max as a memorial to her brother, would have been my great uncle Max.
I mean, I think even people don't even realize just how lucky it is for people to actually know the real death date of a relative in the Holocaust. I got a telephone call from my mother one day at work. She was so happy. They managed to find out the date her grandfather was killed so that they could actually say Kaddish for him on the day that he was killed. She was just like, that's a gift that most people don't get.
Yeah, my mom would, like, again, I thought all my grandparents were alive. My mom was there lighting a yahrzeit candle when I was young, and I didn't know who she was lighting it for. And I remember if I didn't ask her, she said, "Oh, everyone who was killed in the war." But then I found out that she was lighting it for her father. And now I say Kaddish for him on the 10th of Tevet, which is one of the traditional days that we say for people killed in the Holocaust if we don't know when they died.
My grandparents, their tombstones actually have their brothers and sisters' names on them because they don't even have graves.
My grandmother was married and her husband was taken away by the authorities. And so after the war, she couldn't remarry. She was considered a chained woman because they didn't know if he was dead or not. And so for years, she was considered an aguna, that she's still married until they could find testimony that he was, when he was taken by the authorities on fake charges, that ultimately that they killed him.
That's why one of the things, you know, you keep saying, well, why do you have to remember? Why do you have to know all these things? It's, you know, David, you were talking about, you know, from generation to generation. I think that's what shapes every generation. Our history makes us what we are. My grandfather also didn't really talk about the camps, my father's father. When my grandmother died and my father and his brothers were sitting Shiva for her, a man came to see them. My father and his brothers didn't know who he was. My grandfather was lucky. When he was in Auschwitz, he got assigned to the kitchens. The man who visited my father and his brothers during the Shiva told them, and that the reason he was alive was because my grandfather was sneaking him food in the concentration camp. Even in that hell, people didn't lose their humanity. And I think never forget means you shouldn't forget who you are and who we are. And then I try to be that person who lives up to them every day.
For me, I think never forget means to continue to tell the stories so they're not forgotten, to make sure that people know what things lead to. Also, not just to not forget the atrocities that happened, but not to forget the humanity. My grandmother, when she left Germany, she had initially gotten approved to go on that aliyah, but war broke out. And so she wasn't able to leave on the transport. And so she actually got accepted to go through Denmark with the Women's League for Peace and Liberty. And so she ended up spending, I think, 6 months on a farm in Denmark. And she said she'll never forget the generosity and the humanity of the people in Denmark who, would be asking for more Jews. They were asking to have more people come. They put in a request to have her brother come. She sent letters. He was denied because he was too young at first. And then there was a long list of people. But she has all kinds of stories of friends that are non-Jews that hid people in their homes, and people who came to their house after midnight because non-Jews couldn't go visit Jews, and started to warn her family to start saving food and to go into hiding. And so, never forget your allies, and never forget, never forget the atrocities, never forget what leads to, this type of, never forget what led to the Holocaust, but also never forget the humanity in others and seek that out.
Yeah, in fact, when my grandmother took my mom into hiding, again, my mom was like 1942 when they went into hiding. They lived in a well for a while. My mom lost most of her hearing in one of her ears, and they hid in a lot of different places. But there was one Polish family who hid them for, I think, about a month or two, and really saved their life. And once my grandmother, after the war, they went to Germany. They lived there for a little while, and then they came to the U.S. My grandmother every year would send that Polish family money, and they had almost nothing when they came here. But my grandmother made sure that she would write a letter to them and tell them how they were doing, and she sent the money, as far as I know, until she died.
I think to never forget, to the point of how the Holocaust impacted not just the people who went through it, but it impacted generations. The trauma has lasted for generations. In the way that my grandmother felt it was a sin to throw out any food. Until today, I have the hardest time throwing out any food because God forbid we should waste any food. Or the way that if there's something going on in the world, we have to have the radio on, constantly listening to the news to be on top of what's going on. And my parents would wake up screaming in nightmares. My grandparents would wake up screaming from nightmares. That trauma doesn't let us forget what has happened to, all of my grandparents who went through this trauma. Hopefully we can turn that never forgetting of going through that trauma into something positive, in that we would ensure that nobody else has to go through that trauma in the future.
I'll add one thing, I guess, on a more positive note from never forget was my grandmother, my mom's mom, made it through Auschwitz with her sister. When they went into the camps, her father, who unfortunately was murdered in Auschwitz, told both sisters are like, never forget that you have to love each other, and that's how you're going to make it through. You can't forget everyone's a human being that's deserving of respect.
Thank you so much to the speakers for sharing these stories so that we never forget, and for your courage. Naomi's mention of a bond of humanity reminds me of how we can work to support and honor people of all faiths and beliefs. I am not Jewish, but I have throughout my life dedicated spans of time to studying the Holocaust and reading survivor stories, and I'm currently on my 30th book since last May. And the thing that always hits me when I read a survivor story was the same thing I heard from the Holocaust descendants, which is that in many cases during World War II, lives depended on allies. As was mentioned, it starts with slurs and derogatory comments, and then can swiftly devolve into hate, violence, and murder. When I reached out to the interfaith leads at Google, Dell, SAP, and Salesforce last September about joining forces on this event, not one of us could have imagined the resurgence of anti-Semitism that is happening today. In the conversation with the descendants, it was mentioned that part of Never Forget is the people who helped and were allies. Today, our Jewish friends and colleagues are looking to us for allyship and support. It's one thing for Jewish people to stand up for themselves, but it's an entirely other and much more powerful thing when others stand up for our Jewish friends, neighbors, and coworkers. The fact of the matter is, Jewish people make up only 0.02% of the world's population, so it's not enough for them to fight anti-Semitism alone. So in closing, if you are wondering what you can do to help, reach out to a Jewish colleague or friend and check in, see how they are doing and what you can do to support them. If you witness hate speech or hate crimes, anti-Semitic or otherwise, one of the most powerful things you can do to help is to be an upstander and speak up. I will now turn it over to the AJC, who will share resources on anti-Semitism. Thank you.
Thank you, Dell, Google, Equinix, Salesforce, SAP, and ServiceNow for allowing American Jewish Committee to host this important program as we commemorate International Holocaust Remembrance Day. We are encouraged that technology companies mobilize to make this event happen. AJC was founded in 1906. We are one of the oldest American Jewish organizations, but our mission is to protect the Jewish people around the world, something we failed at during the Holocaust. The stories we just heard inspire us to act. The same anti-Semitism that led to the Holocaust, unfortunately, did not end with the Holocaust. Anti-Semitism is increasing. In fact, just in the last few months, there has been a global increase of almost 1,200%. Today, 8 decades after the Holocaust, Holocaust denial, Holocaust distortion, and Holocaust inversion, blaming Jews for the genocide, are all on the rise. These are double wounds and insults, turning victims into perpetrators. We must speak out against this. So how do we be an upstander for the Jewish community? How do we be an ally for Jews and Jewish victims of anti-Semitism in the same way we stand up for any other victimized group? First, we listen. Listen to Jews and their stories, and understand who Jews are and their history. Be part of a universalism that includes Jews. Second, understand and recognize anti-Semitism in all its forms. It's more than a hatred. It's a conspiracy about Jewish power and control. The same anti-Semitic conspiracies that Hitler invoked to perpetuate the Holocaust still exist, but in new forms, online and on social media. And lastly, be part of the effort to prevent anti-Semitism. Using cutting-edge technology to counter anti-Jewish bias and misinformation is key. So technology companies play a central role, and your participation is urgently needed now. Please go to ajc.org/anti-Semitism, where you can access critical resources on how to recognize the problem and respond. One in particular I recommend is Translate Hate, which is a glossary of dozens of anti-Semitic terms and tropes. AJC also offers trainings and briefings customized to each company, so please do not hesitate to reach out. Thank you for listening and lifting up the voices of survivors, honoring the victims, and speaking up for Jewish communities around the world.